The Great Depression. America's roaring economic prosperity of the 1920s came to a shocking halt on October 29, 1929, a day etched into history as Black Tuesday, when the stock market crashed, triggering a 43-month economic catastrophe. This market collapse decimated fortunes and set off a chain reaction that caused GDP to plummet by 26.7% and left 25.6% of the workforce unemployed. Families that had reveled in the nation's wealth mere years before found themselves destitute, their livelihoods ripped away. With less money to spend, consumer demand plunged, forcing companies to drastically cut production and lay off millions of workers. In response, the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) was formed in 1933 to enforce regulations against rampant stock speculation. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation (FDIC), created in 1934, insured bank deposits to restore faith after widespread failures. President Roosevelt's New Deal programs also aimed to rebuild the shattered economy through government spending. The Roosevelt Recession. As the economy began recovering from the depths of the Great Depression, a new recession struck from May 1937 through June 1938, lasting 13 months. This economic relapse, dubbed the recession within the Depression, resulted from policymakers prematurely tightening fiscal and monetary policies. While well-intentioned efforts to curb budget deficits and inflation, the policy shifts ended up short-circuiting the fragile economic progress made under the New Deal programs up to that point. Industrial production plummeted by a staggering 32% as a result of the policy missteps. With production in freefall, unemployment spiked back up to 20% during this 13-month span, while GDP declined by 10%. It wasn't until policymakers reversed course that the United States economy finally emerged from the shadow of the Great Depression and its lingering aftershock, the Roosevelt Recession. The Union Recession. As World War II was ending in 1945, the U.S. economy hit a rough patch that lasted 8 months from February to October. With the war over, the nation had to transition from a wartime economy driving military production to a peacetime economy making consumer goods. This shift meant the government drastically cut spending, which caused GDP to drop by 10.9% over those 8 months as factories slowed down. On top of that, labor unions went on strike, further disrupting production levels, with the unemployment rate peaking at 3.8%. The post-war recession. Just a few years after that rough changeover from war, the economy stumbled again, with a shorter 11-month recession from November 1948 to October 1949. GDP dipped by 1.7% and unemployment peaked at 7.9% during this time, but compared to the devastation of the Great Depression, this 11-month slump was nothing too dramatic. It simply allowed things to settle after so many Americans went on a buying spree with their pent-up wages from the war years. The post-Korean War recession. Similar to what happened after World War II ended, the economy hit another speed bump from July 1953 through May 1954 when the Korean War wound down. Just like in 1945, the government drastically cut back on military spending once the troops returned home. This sudden drop in war spending caused prices for regular goods and services to rise quickly, as consumers had more to spend, but there weren't enough, leading to inflation heating up on the consumer side. To get these rising costs under control, the Federal Reserve made it more difficult for people and businesses to borrow money. While this cooled off inflation, it also slowed economic growth overall. The end result was a 10-month recession, where GDP dipped by 2.7% and the unemployment rate peaked at 5.9% as both consumers and businesses pumped the brakes on spending. The Eisenhower Recession. In late 1957, a powerful Asian flu outbreak swept across the U.S., reducing the available workforce and hampering production. Around the same time, the Federal Reserve had been raising interest rates to curb inflation, making it more expensive for consumers to borrow money to buy homes and cars. This combination of factors triggered an 8-month economic slump from August 1957 to April 1958. GDP fell 3.7% and unemployment hit 7.4% as the housing market stalled and auto sales plunged. After 8 months, stimulus measures and lowering interest rates helped get the economy going again without a total meltdown. The Rolling Adjustment Recession. This 10-month economic slump from April 1960 to February 1961 earned its name from how it rippled through the auto industry first. At the time, American automakers were losing sales to cheaper imported vehicles. As they cut production and jobs, it created a domino effect that dragged down other industries too. Overall GDP dipped 1.6% and unemployment hit 6.9%. The Nixon recession. In 1971, President Nixon decided to eliminate the US dollar's convertibility to gold, ending the gold standard currency system. This move allowed the dollar's value to fluctuate more freely. As the dollar lost value against other currencies, imported goods became more expensive, driving up inflation. To combat rising inflation, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively. Higher borrowing costs slowed economic activity, leading to the 11-month recession from December 1969 through November 1970. During the downturn, GDP dipped 0.6% and unemployment peaked at 5.9%. While relatively short-lived, this recession foreshadowed mounting troubles like rising inflation that would plague the economy in the years ahead after the transition to floating fiat currency. The oil shock recession. In 1973, the OPEC oil embargo quadrupled oil prices overnight, delivering an economic body blow that triggered a 16-month recession. To combat skyrocketing costs, the Federal Reserve aggressively hiked interest rates, making borrowing much more expensive. The combination of spiking energy prices and higher borrowing costs proved disastrous. GDP fell 3% as consumer spending shrank, while unemployment peaked at 8.6%. Alarmingly, the economy experienced persistent high inflation and stagnant growth, a phenomenon dubbed stagflation. This severe economic slump exposed the vulnerabilities created by America's dependence on foreign oil. The double-dip recession. The economy experienced a brutal 1-2 punch of recessions in the early 1980s. The first strike came in 1980 as the Federal Reserve, led by Paul Volcker, raised interest rates to unprecedented levels to finally break the back of 1970s-era stagflation. This 6-month recession caused GDP to dip 2.2%. But inflation remained stubbornly high, forcing Volcker to drive rates up even further to 19% by 1981. This second, more severe 16-month recession delivered a knockout blow. GDP plunged 2.9% and unemployment peaked at a staggering 10.8% before inflation finally subsided in late 1982. The Gulf War recession. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, a major global oil producer, in August 1990 sent oil prices skyrocketing, dealing a major blow to the U.S. economy already struggling with the savings and loan crisis fallout. This storm triggered an 8-month recession from July 1990 through March 1991. GDP dipped 1.5% as higher energy costs slowed consumer spending, while unemployment peaked at 6.8%. The dot-com recession. The 1990s tech boom came to a crashing halt in March 2001, as overvalued internet stocks led the Nasdaq to shed nearly 80% of its value. This dot-com bubble bursting dragged the U.S. economy into an 8-month recession. While relatively shallow with just a 0.3% GDP dip and 5.5% peak unemployment, it marked a harsh reckoning after years of buoyancy. The economic pain was compounded when the 9/11 attacks occurred just months into the downturn. However, the Federal Reserve's quick interest rate cuts helped limit the severity. This short recession provided lessons about technology valuations and transitioning to a new economic era. The Great Recession. The bursting of the U.S. housing bubble and subprime mortgage crisis triggered the worst economic slump since the Great Depression. This 18-month recession saw GDP plunge 4.3% as unemployment peaked at 9.5%. At the core was a banking crisis, as major institutions had recklessly invested in risky subprime mortgages. When homeowners defaulted en masse, it set off a chain reaction of failures and bailouts as the financial system seized up and the stock market plummeted over 50%. The COVID-19 recession. As the coronavirus pandemic hit in early 2020, severe lockdowns to contain the virus brought the U.S. economy to a standstill, triggering a 2-month recession from February to April. However, its brevity belied its sheer devastating force. GDP contracted at a staggering 31.2% annualized rate in Q2 as nationwide shutdowns took effect. Unemployment skyrocketed from 3.5% to 14.7%, with over 20 million jobs lost in just 2 months. Thankfully, the Federal Reserve and Congress responded with historically massive monetary and fiscal stimulus to keep the economy afloat. Interest rates were slashed to zero, while over $5 trillion in pandemic relief aid was deployed. While the US was predicted to experience another inflation in 2023, it was avoided. While some are predicting another inflation for 2024, others say it will be a soft landing rather than an inflation. What do you think will happen? Also, what else do you think contributed to any of these major recessions discussed in the video? I would like to hear from you in the comments section. If you enjoyed this, kindly like the video, hit the subscribe button and click on the bell icon. I'll be making more videos like this.